Bird photography the easy way with the OM Systems OM-1 and the ED 100-400 IS zoom. For many years now, I've promoted and taught an easy way of photographing nature, which I call the easy point-and-shoot method, that is the EzPnS. It started with the first point-and-shoot super zoom cameras, compact, relatively inexpensive, small sensor cameras that had increasingly long, fixed, that is non-interchangeable, zoom lenses, eventually reaching 1600 to 2000 millimeter equivalent, and even one Nikon model out to 3000 millimeters. That's over 3 times the magnification of the longest conventional wildlife lenses, and they often had better automation than the then current crop of full-frame DSLRs, that's digital single-lens reflex cameras, the kind the pros used at the time. These point-and-shoot super zoom cameras made bird and wildlife photography possible, and even relatively easy for those who were not willing to buy and carry a complete DSLR outfit, at least one body and a long lens, costing many thousands of dollars and weighing up to 10 or even 15 pounds. My method is simple. Set the camera's automation up so that it produces consistently well-exposed and well-focused JPEG images on its own, under the widest variety of conditions, so that you do not have to think about each exposure as you take it in the field. Trust the camera to do its job and let the camera do its job, leaving you free to find and frame the birds and wildlife and landscapes point and shoot. As a bonus, your exposures will be consistent enough to require a minimal amount of post-processing so that you can spend less time processing and more time in the field. With every camera I own, after a few weeks, or maybe months, of experimentation, I generally end up with a few different sets of modifications to the program mode, one for birds and wildlife, or one for birds and one for wildlife, depending on the camera, one specifically for birds in flight and very active wildlife, and one for landscapes. My bird modifications almost always work well for macro shots as well. I commit these sets of modifications to the camera's memories, and then just switch back and forth between memories in the field as needed. Point and shoot. EzPnS. Recently, I switched to the OM Systems OM-1 and their ED 100-400 millimeter IS zoom for birds and wildlife, and quite a bit of macro as it turns out. The fact is, the point-and-shoot method works with any camera with a long enough zoom or telephoto lens to fill the frame with your subject, and good enough automation to take care of the technical side. But today, with the advent of the new advanced mirrorless systems, the more you're willing to spend, and the more weight you're willing to carry, up to a point, the easier the PNS method becomes. Notice I did not say you would get better results. The best images from a small sensor point-and-shoot super zoom camera under most conditions and at reasonable sizes or reasonable viewing distances are almost indistinguishable from those taken with a full-frame mirrorless and a long lens. But with the larger camera, you'll get more best shots, and the whole process will be easier. The camera will, in fact, do more for you and leave you even freer to just PNS. We are talking top-of-the-line mirrorless cameras here, the ones with bird's eye and animal eye autofocus tracking built in, the OM Systems OM-1, the Nikon Z9, the Canon R3, and the Sony A1. I went with the OM Systems OM-1 because of its cost, size, and weight advantages. It costs less, weighs less, and it's more compact overall, so easier to carry. It's still twice as expensive as the best fixed zoom point-and-shoot camera with a smaller sensor, and weighs about twice as much, but with its better image quality and more sophisticated automation, and a lens that reaches 800 millimeter equivalent, it's really the ultimate PNS camera for bird and wildlife photography. So, let's set the OM Systems OM-1 up for easy PNS photography. We'll start with perched and slowly feeding birds, our bird modifications to program mode. The good news is that for both wildlife and birds in flight, you can start with this same set of modifications we're making here. You will not have to completely redo everything. By assigning these modifications, the whole set in just a few button presses, to a new custom memory, and then making just a few modifications, you can quickly and easily create your birds in flight and wildlife modifications and save them to their own custom memories. See the videos on birds in flight and wildlife. Let me point out that in this video, I'm only going to talk about the settings and features of the camera that you need to modify for bird photography. This camera will do almost anything you could imagine that any camera might do, but you only need to know the things that will make a difference in what you're trying to do. In this case, take satisfying photos of birds. Also, there are 3 completely different ways of accessing most of the controls and settings of the OM-1. There's the traditional menu system, accessed via the menu button on the upper left of the camera's back. This gives access to all but a few of the features. Then there's the Super Control Panel, a kind of submenu of the things you might need to change as you work in the field, accessed by the button between the menu button and the viewfinder, or by pressing the center button of the 5-way control wheel on the back of the camera to the right of the viewing screen, while in any photo mode. Finally, many of the settings and functions have dedicated buttons on the body. For ease, and to make it easier to follow along in this video with the many modifications, I'm going to work first with the menu system, starting at the first page and working through page by page. The Super Control Panel might seem easier because there are way less options, but the Super Control Panel is really for field work in the moment, to change settings for an individual photo or situation. The menu is where you make changes that you intend to use on every photo. As you work through this, remember, this is a process you will only have to do once. Take your time. Review the sections of the video as often as you need to get it right. If it seems like it takes forever, and there are just so many settings to make, just remember that there are really only so many settings to make. And once set, you are not really going to ever have to think about them again. EzPnS, bird photography the easy way. Just set your camera up the way I will show you here, and then go out and have fun taking photos of birds. This first video will only cover the basic modifications to program mode. There's a second video that covers the actual process of taking photos, the field craft, and the buttons and controls you will be using regularly in the field. All modifications are based on the program mode. Program is actually programmed auto exposure and is just like full auto in that the camera controls the focus and exposure and white balance based on its own internal programs and the light readings from the sensor, except that in program you can change the way the camera focuses, where it focuses, the way it computes exposure, and where it takes its readings, the basic exposure parameters like ISO, the default white balance, the way the camera processes JPEG files, etc., etc. You might have noticed that the OM system's OM-1, unlike almost every other camera on the market today, actually has no auto mode. The A you see on the main control dial is aperture, not auto. So, turn the camera on using the switch to the left of the viewfinder. Put the camera in program using the main control dial on the top right of the camera next to the viewfinder. That's the P. If it is not already visible, open and fold out the LCD panel view screen on the back of the camera so you can see it. If it already isn't, you might also want to flip it around so it can be folded flat against the back of the camera. Press the menu button on the upper left. The title of the first menu page is Basic Settings and Image Quality. Remember this first page, as we're going to come back here at the very end to set the custom mode for birds. You will navigate up and down on this page to highlight individual settings by using the up and down buttons on the 5-way control wheel. Again, that's the little wheel next to the view screen on the right. The up button is on top, the down button is on the bottom. If you don't press anything else, the left and right buttons on the 5-way control wheel will change menu pages. You can also use the back thumb wheel on the upper right of the body. The front thumb wheel built into the grip of the camera will change to a whole new set of pages, from the exposure to the focus pages, for instance. You use the center button of the 5-way wheel to select a setting, once it is highlighted, for modification. Once the modification page opens, you'll use the up and down, left and right buttons on the 5-way control wheel as needed to highlight the correct setting, and then on most screens, the center button to select it. Sometimes selecting also returns you to the main menu, but sometimes you'll have to use the menu button to return to the main menu. There is a menu button alert at the lower left of the page when this is necessary. Depending on how deep the setting option pages are for that particular feature, you might have to press the menu button more than once to get back to the main menu. If your camera is brand new, or you've not made many adjustments using the menu system, you can just get right on to the next section. But if you have made significant changes, you might want to reset to factory defaults before you begin this process. Use the front thumb wheel to switch through the page sections until you get to the wrench. The front thumb wheel is finicky, and it may take you a few tries to land on the wrench. The page title will be 1 Card Folder File. Use the right button on the 5-way control wheel or the back thumb wheel to move through the wrench pages until you get to the last one, titled Reset Clock Language Others. Use the up and down buttons as needed to highlight the first entry, Reset Initialize Settings. Press the center button on the 5-way control to see the options. Choose the first option, Reset Shooting Settings. Press the center button on the 5-way control. Highlight Yes using the up button on the 5-way control. Press the center button to select. Press the menu button to return to the main menu page. Now use the front thumb wheel to return to the first camera menu page where you started. Back on the first camera menu page, under Custom Settings is a camera with a broken diamond. This is your image quality setting. Scroll down using the down button on the bottom of the 5-way control so it is highlighted. Press the center button of the 5-way control to see your options. Note that you can set image quality independently for each of the 2 possible storage cards. They do not even have to be the same setting. We'll work with card 1, which should already be highlighted. Press the center button of the 5-way control to see options. Scroll to LSF, which is Large Superfine JPEG. Press the center button to select it. I shoot only in JPEG, since this camera and most modern digital cameras has such good JPEG engines that, in my opinion, shooting in RAW is no longer necessary. If you use my modifications to program, you will almost always get correctly exposed images. The OM-1 has enough ways to adjust the JPEG in camera to overcome any limitations of shooting in JPEG. The advantage is that once set, those adjustments are applied to every image you shoot before you ever see it. That means more correctly exposed images right out of the camera, and less time post-processing after the fact. That's part of what the EzPnS method is all about. Press the menu button to return to the main menu. Scroll down to Image Aspect and press the center button. Then select 4x3 by using the up and down button on the 5-way control wheel until 4x3 shows. Pressing the center button will lock in the setting and return you to the main menu. 4x3 uses all the available pixels of the sensor and should be your choice unless you are shooting still images to include in a video, in which case you might select 16:9, or if shooting specifically for Instagram, etc., where you might want a square image, 1:1. You can always crop your 4:3 images to any ratio you want when processing. Set Image Review to Off by selecting it in the menu and pressing the center button on the 5-way control, then scrolling to Off, then pressing the center button again. Again, here this returns you to the main menu. When shooting birds and wildlife, you do not want to automatically see what you just shot, not for every photo. You are going to be taking a lot of photos. Using similar scrolling and button presses, set Shading Comp to On. When shooting JPEGs, this lightens the corners and edges of each photo to remove the hotspot effect of most digital camera lenses. This is something you would have to do manually in post-processing when shooting RAW. Press the left button on the 5-way control to move to the next menu page, or use the back thumb wheel. This page is called Picture Mode WB. That stands for White Balance. Open Picture Mode. This setting controls the way JPEGs are processed in the camera. Remember what I said above. The changes you make here and in a few other settings will ensure that your JPEGs look as good as they can right out of the camera. They will still be improved by post-processing, but let us make the camera do everything it can for us. Again, that's the PNS method. For birds, I use number 3, which is natural. Highlight Picture Mode. Press the center button. Select number 3, natural, using the left and right buttons on the 5-way wheel. This setting reads the sensor and the scene and attempts to process the JPEG to give it an even balance of tones across the spectrum of light and dark with correct or natural color values. Now, without pressing the center button, scroll down the settings on the left using the up and down buttons on the 5-way wheel. You'll see a little box with an S line through it. This controls the balance between light and dark values in processing the JPEG. Select Auto by scrolling to it. This setting will add some extra processing to the shadows of the image to lighten them, which will help even out the exposure after making all the other exposure modifications we're going to make. Do not press the center button. On this page, it will take you right out of the menu system altogether. Press the menu button to return to the main menu. The next option is Picture Mode Settings. And it's one of those weird OM system settings that only controls what options are visible in settings. Skip it. Set WB, White Balance, to Auto, again using the center button and the up and down buttons on the 5-way control as needed. In my experience, the OM-1 does not need any help in determining the color balance of the scene. From now on, if I do not mention a setting, you can assume I'm skipping it, leaving it at its default value. As long as you have not changed it from when you first got the camera, you can ignore it. Set Keep Warm Color On to On. This tells the camera that if you are taking photos at the golden hour, the hour before sunset, it should keep the warm hue of the light. That is, of course, a matter of taste. Next, move to the next menu page using the back button wheel or the right button on the 5-way control. This page is called ISO Noise Reduction. Set ISO A upper limit default to 25,600 and 200 respectively. The camera has excellent low-light performance, and you can get usable images, certainly better than no image at all, right up to ISO 25,600 and above in an emergency, but I leave it at 25,600. 200 is the base ISO on the OM-1 and will give you the least noise and best colors and widest dynamic range. On this page, either the center button or the menu button will return you to the main menu, but only the center button will register any changes you make. Do not press the center button until you've changed both values. Set ISO A, lowest shutter speed, to 1/6400th. Press the center button to open the options. Scroll over Off Auto to the shutter speed scale. Press the center button to open options. Scroll up or down until 1/6400th shows. Press the center button to register your setting and return to the main menu. 1/6400th will allow for hand holding the 100 to 400 millimeter zoom under most conditions. The camera will work with aperture and mostly with ISO to maintain a shutter speed of 1/6400th until the ISO reaches your maximum setting. You can set the minimum shutter speed higher to be safe, but that will just push your ISO even higher in low light conditions. Set noise filter to standard. This removes background noise in JPEG processing. The OM-1 uses an AI noise filter that is quite effective at removing noise without removing detail. Set low ISO processing to detail priority. This tells the camera you value image detail over speed between shots when it has to choose in extreme low light. Set noise reduction to auto. Noise reduction only kicks in when the sensor is overheated. Hopefully you will never need it, but let it work if it needs to. Move to the next menu page, Exposure. Scroll down and set exposure shift to -2/6. When you highlight exposure shift and press the center button, you will get 3 options, each a different metering pattern. Choose the first one and press the center button. Use the up and down buttons on the 5-way control to change the scale that opens to match -2/6. Make sure it is -2/6, not positive. The OM-1 favors shadows over highlights, which makes some sense when shooting people, but without changing this setting, the camera will consistently overexpose the brightest portions of the bird's feathers, especially white feathers, causing a loss of detail in those areas when the JPEG is processed. If you were shooting raw, it might not matter, though I suspect it still would. But this is one of those cases where we can adjust the camera to produce the best JPEGs without having to resort to raw processing. This setting reduces the exposure of every photo you take by 1/3 of a stop, protecting the highlights. You can always recover detail in the shadows of an image in post-processing. You cannot easily recover detail in blown-out or overexposed JPEG highlights. This setting is critical to day-to-day satisfaction with the camera when shooting birds in any kind of bright light. It is also why we set the picture mode as we did. You will notice that you can set the shift differently depending on the metering mode in use. You're setting the first option, ESP metering, which is what I use for birds. See the next menu page. Press the center button to lock in the setting, then press Menu to go back to the main menu. Move to the next menu page using the right button on the 5-way control or the back thumb wheel. Metering. Set metering to the first option, which is their AI-assisted ESP exposure. It will automatically read the scene and make allowances for the apparent subject and different levels of light, including some adjustment for backlit situations. Set metering during AEL to auto. Set AEL, that's auto exposure lock, with half pressing to SAF only. This tells the camera to meter continuously when you're using continuous focus, or CAF, which means you are probably following a subject or framing a subject, and light values are presumably still changing. If you have single autofocus, SAF, set, it probably means that your subject is stationary, and it is safe to lock the exposure value when you half press the shutter release. Set metering during continuous shooting, the stacked images icon, to yes. Move on to the next menu page, Flash. We're not changing anything here, so move right on to the page after it, which is Drive mode. Set drive to silent continuous, the first icon on the second row, a stack of images with a little letter S. This means that the camera will continue to take exposures as long as you hold the shutter release down, and you will not hear the artificial shutter noise for each exposure, which might disturb your subjects. You never want to take just one photo of anything. A burst of 5 photos increases your chances of catching just what you want dramatically. On the other hand, a burst of 10 shots will contain a lot of close duplicates, which is why we are going to adjust the frame rate in the setting below. This next one is a little tricky, so follow along. Open Sequential Shooting Settings. You will have a list of icons representing the different drive modes. You set drive to silent continuous above the little S in the stack of images. Scroll down to this. Click the right button of the 5-way control wheel to open options. Note that this is not the way almost any other menu option works, but there you have it. The frames per second number should be highlighted. Press the center button again to open options. You'll have a list of shooting speeds. Find 5 frames per second in the list and highlight it. You'll probably have to scroll up a ways using the up and down buttons on the 5-way control. Press the center button once more to select it. Now press the menu button to return to the previous screen, and then press it again to return to the menu. You can, of course, set this to any value you want, but for perched and slowly moving birds, I find that 5 frames per second is more than enough. I still bring home way too many exposures, and many of those are near duplicates. Setting the frame rate higher, just in my opinion, increases your wasted shots, unless, of course, you're shooting very active or moving subjects. Even then, except for birds in actual flight, I find that 5 frames per second is enough to capture an action sequence without too many duplicate frames. Move to the next menu page, Image Stabilizer. Set Still Image Stabilizer, the first one, to SIS Auto. Unless your camera is tripod mounted, image stabilization is a good idea. It is image stabilization that makes it possible to handhold a long lens like the 100 to 400 millimeter zoom. The OM system has both in-body and in-lens stabilization. The auto setting will attempt to select the best combination of stabilizations to give you the sharpest shots. Set Continuous Shooting Image Stabilizer, the second one, to IS Priority. Stabilization takes a bit of time, and if you are, say, panning and following a bird, the camera will slow down the continuous frame rate to make sure stabilization keeps up. Set Handheld Assist to On. Set IS Priority to Off if it is not already. This setting is only required if using non-OM system lenses. Pressing the left button on the 5-way wheel this time takes you to a whole new section of menus. We're not going to be making any changes here. The easiest way to get to the next whole section without stepping through each menu page in this section is to use the front thumb wheel on the camera body to move a whole section. Rotate it 1 click clockwise. This should bring up the autofocus menu pages. Once more, the front thumb wheel is a bit clunky. It may take you several tries to get the right pages highlighted. Set Still Image Autofocus Mode to CAF, Continuous Autofocus. This will tell the camera to focus between frames when taking a sequence of photos, and to focus as you are framing the shot, as long as you have the shutter release halfway down. Set Still Image AF plus MF to On. This will keep manual focus active, even when you have the camera and lens in autofocus. This is useful for quickly establishing focus when the camera is struggling, or for touching up focus when needed. On the 100 to 400 millimeter zoom, the focus ring is the one furthest out on the lens barrel. Move on to the next menu page, to AF. AF Illuminator is on by default. AF Area Pointer, set it to On To. This engages both the focus and the eye detection indicators. Then comes the main feature, subject detection. Set it to birds. At last. This is what it's all about. With the camera set to detect birds, the camera will automatically identify any bird or bird-like subject in the frame and focus on the eye if possible. You have to see it in action to believe how well it works. Bird subject detection works for birds, dragonflies, butterflies, bees, and, in my experience, turtles and squirrels, or squirrel-like animals. It also works fairly well on larger animals. If there is an eye there, it will find it. If it comes right down to it, shoot animals in bird mode, but do not attempt to shoot birds in animal mode. That doesn't work very well, if at all. Set eye detection frame to On. It does not matter, but it provides some reassurance that the system is working when the little green box lands on the eye. The next set of pages is settings for movie mode. You can skip on to operations pages using the front thumb wheel. Under operations, we're going to make a few changes to make life easier in the field. Highlight button settings and press the center button of the 5-way control. Press the center button again to select Camera Button function. You will see a diagram of the camera with its buttons pointed out and connected to a list of icons that show the current settings of all the buttons. Personally, I sometimes use the digital teleextender function, but to do that, you have to program it to one of the existing buttons on the camera. This function, when shooting JPEGs, magnifies the center of the frame by 2x, doubling your equivalent focal length. on the 100 to 400 millimeter zoom, which is already a 200 to 800 millimeter equivalent field of view. This gives you a 400 to 1600 millimeter zoom. Clearly, it is not much use at 400 through 800 millimeters, since your zoom already covers that field of view without magnification, but it can come in useful for small distant birds at the long end of the zoom. Since we are still in camera mode and the movie button is not really needed, I program the digital teleextender to the movie button where it falls handily under my thumb when I need it. To do that, highlight the movie button in the list, the second icon. Press the center button of the 5-way control wheel. Scroll up and down and side to side until you find the magnified 2x icon. Press the center button again to select. Then scroll down the list of buttons again. You'll see the diagram changes to show you the buttons on the camera body. Keep going until you come to the lower button on the front of the camera. I set this to multifunction. This gives me access to another hidden feature of the OM-1, which is highlight shadow control. More about that later. But, like digital teleconverter, you have to have it programmed to a button before it will work. When you have made these two changes, press the menu button to return to the operations page. Scroll down to multi-selector settings. This is the little jockey wheel or joystick we'll talk about when we get to setting your focus area. Unfortunately, the camera comes from the factory with the push-down function of this button turned off. I like it to open the settings for focus area instead. So, after pressing the center button on the 5-way control wheel, highlighting center button and pressing the 5-way control wheel one more time, I scroll over to the icon for focus area and select it by pressing the center button one last time. Now, when I press down the multi-selector control, the little joystick, it will open the focus area selection panel. Scroll down to FN lever settings. Press the center button of the 5-way wheel to bring up options. Select camera function lever and press. Choose mode 2. This sets the camera to use the function lever around the AEL button to change between continuous autofocus and single autofocus. This sometimes comes in handy when working a bird in a difficult focus situation. See the video to follow on using the camera in the field. Now scroll over to the Displays page using the back thumb wheel or the right button on the 5-way control. The first item is Grid Settings. I like my viewfinders to display a simple golden ratio grid to help me to remember my composition when taking photos. If you're with me on that, press the center button, scroll to Displayed Grid, press the center button. Golden ratio is the third icon. Once selected, you'll have to press the menu button to get back to the main menu. There are just a few things left to set before we commit these settings to custom memory. They are available in the Super Control panel, accessed by the second button on the upper left of the camera back, or by pressing the center button of the 5-way control when in shooting mode, but they're also available using dedicated buttons on the camera body. I'll show you how to set them using the dedicated buttons. Exit all menus and make sure the camera is in program mode and ready to take photos. First, while we set limits for ISO previously, we did not actually set ISO. ISO controls the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. You turn it up in dim light and down in bright light. Low is always better for image detail, dynamic range, and color accuracy. But the OM-1 handles low light and higher ISOs very well. You can manually control ISO, or you can, and in my opinion should, let the camera do that automatically, keeping ISO in balance with reasonable shutter speeds and apertures as part of programmed auto exposure. Press the ISO button on the upper right corner of the back of the camera. See the scale at the bottom of the viewfinder or screen? Now use the left and right buttons of the 5-way control to scroll left or right until you see the word Recommended above and ISO Auto followed by some number below it. The number will depend on the actual light on the sensor at that moment, but it'll always say Auto before it. Press the center button of the 5-way control wheel to select it, or half press the shutter button. That will select it as well. Now, finally, we're going to choose a focus area. You already have the camera set up to recognize birds and find the eye, but the focus area can also be set to anything from the full sensor, all, to a single point in the center. You can also set it for a cross that covers the center area or design your own custom setting. This is something that I'm still experimenting with even after 100,000 shots or more. And I do need to point out that at this point in time, the focus and recognition features do not work together as well as I think they should. Just because the camera correctly recognizes the bird and puts a box around it, even when it finds the eye, that does not mean that the camera will focus on the bird. In order for it to focus on the bird, some part of the white box around the bird has to intersect the green focus area box, or cross. And even then, it might select something directly under the focus area to focus on instead of the bird, especially if it cannot find the bird's eye. Just remember, if you want the camera to focus on the bird, you have to move the focus area to at least touch the white bird recognition box. This seems like something OM systems might want to work on and update in future firmware. Still, focus is remarkably accurate the vast majority of the time. You will want to experiment with different focus areas, especially if you're shooting larger birds. I use the all setting for birds in flight, for instance, and when foreground foliage is not a major issue, which is most of the time, I use the small focus area, and the cross can be effective and considerably faster than a single focus point for larger birds. What seems to work best for small birds in dense foliage and for perched or slowly moving birds where focus time is not an issue is a single focus spot in the center of the field. This will allow you to focus even through foliage, as long as you can get the center spot on some portion of the bird. Again, this focus area setting is accessible via the Super Control panel or via the jockey control on the back of the camera, the multi-selection button. We just changed the behavior of the multi-selection control so that pressing it down opens the panel where the current focus area is highlighted in green, and you'll see a little wheel symbol at the top of the screen. This means that you can use the front thumb wheel of the camera, built into the grip, to change between focus areas. Rotate it, and you will scroll through the options, from single point to all. If you choose anything except all, you may have to recenter the focus frame by pressing down on the jockey control again, or by rocking it to manually recenter. It's this rocking motion that would actually move the focus point if you needed to get it right over the bird, for instance. The other way to do this is to press the center button of the 5-way wheel to bring up the Super Control panel. Scroll to the left end of the second row and press the center button. Rotate the front control wheel to change the focus areas. You can do that without ever taking your eye away from the viewfinder. One more change. Remember when we set the bottom button on the front of the camera to multifunction? We are now going to use it to make the final adjustment to the way the camera processes JPEGs. Some cameras have a feature that uses AI to adjust the balance between light, highlights, and shadow. On the OM-1, you can do this manually. With this camera, knocking down the highlights and pushing up the shadows will result in more evenly exposed images in almost all situations, exposures that will require less post-processing. Press the bottom button on the front of the camera. You'll see a graph on the screen. At the top, there are back and front wheel symbols and SH and HI. To push up the shadows, use the back wheel. I set this to +4. To tone down the highlights, use the front wheel on the camera. I set this to -3. When done, pressing the center button or lightly pressing the shutter release will return you to shooting mode. Once set, the camera will remember your processing preferences and apply them to every JPEG. Okay, that's it. You are ready to commit these settings to a custom mode. The camera will, in fact, remember these settings on its own. If you make no changes, whenever you put the main control dial in P, these will be the settings you're using. It is safer, though, to record them in a custom mode, so you can always get back to them just by setting the control dial to C1 or C2 or whatever you choose. Go back to the main menu using the menu button. If you're not already on the first menu page, use the front control wheel on the grip of the camera to move back there. The first selection is Custom Mode. Highlight it and press the center button on the 5-way control. There are 4 choices here, Custom 1 through 4. I put my bird settings in Custom 1 since I use them more than any other program modifications. Highlight your choice and press the center button of the 5-way control. This brings up the Recall, Assign, and Save Settings page. Highlight Assign and press the center button on the 5-way control. Highlight Set and press the center button on the 5-way control one more time. Now press the menu button 3 times to get back to the main menu. Finally, make sure the buttons on your 100 to 400 millimeter zoom are set to 1.3 meters to infinity, AF and IS on. That is autofocus and image stabilization on. If you followed all the way through and made the changes I've recommended, you are ready for your first EzPnS bird photo session. The hard part is done. Let the fun begin. Go out to the park or the forest or the shore, anywhere there are birds, and PNS. Let the camera do its thing while you concentrate on finding and framing the birds at the moment you want to capture. Be sure to watch the video on the EzPnS OM-1 and ED 100 to 400 millimeter zoom fieldcraft, which will cover some tips for actually shooting in the field, how to hold and handle and carry the camera, which buttons to use when, and how to assess a situation and a subject for best effect. And remember, the settings you just made and committed to a custom memory will form the basis of both your birds in flight and your wildlife modifications. You will not have to reset everything. Only a few changes are necessary to create your birds in flight and wildlife custom modes. Now, seriously, go find some birds and have some fun.